It was a cool Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the air feels fresh and calm, and the streets are just waking up. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. In the middle of the city, a small cafe sat quietly on the corner, its warm lights spilling out onto the sidewalk. It was the kind of place where people went to escape the rush, to sip coffee slowly, and watch the world pass by. Clara had decided to take her daughter, Sophie, there for breakfast. It had been a busy week at work, filled with meetings, deadlines, and late nights. Clara was a CEO of a growing company, and her days were always full. But weekends were different. Weekends belonged to Sophie. No phone calls, no rushing. Just time with her little girl. Sophie was 8 years old and full of life. She loved drawing, chocolate pastries, and looking at the world with curious eyes. But Sophie was different from most children. She had been born without the ability to speak. Her voice was silent, but her hands spoke volumes. She communicated through sign language, a beautiful, graceful dance of fingers and expressions. Clara had learned to understand her completely, and together they had built their own little world of words without sound. That morning, Clara held Sophie's small hand as they walked toward the cafe. Sophie wore her favorite yellow scarf, the one that made her eyes look even brighter. They stepped inside, and the familiar smell of coffee and fresh bread wrapped around them like a blanket. Clara took a deep breath, already feeling the stress of the week melting away. The cafe was busier than usual. Almost every table was taken, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the room. Clara scanned the place, looking for an empty spot. There was just one table free, a small one in the corner, right next to a man who sat alone. He looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed in a simple sweater, with a worn leather notebook open in front of him. His coffee steamed gently, untouched for the moment, as he wrote something down. Clara gave a polite smile as she led Sophie to the table. Sophie, as always, was quietly observing everything. She loved noticing the smallest details, the way the steam swirled from a cup, the sound of the coffee machine, the shapes in the foam of a latte. She sat down, swinging her legs slightly under the chair. Clara placed their coats on the back of the chairs and handed Sophie a napkin. Sophie began folding it absent-mindedly while her mother went up to the counter to order their usual, a hot chocolate and a croissant for Sophie, a cappuccino, and a slice of banana bread for herself. While Clara was away, Sophie's napkin slipped from her lap and fluttered to the floor, stopping near the man's feet. He noticed it and bent down to pick up. As he held it out to her, something unexpected happened. Instead of just giving her the napkin with a simple "here you go," he moved his hands in a way that Sophie immediately recognized. He signed to her, "You're welcome." For a moment, Sophie froze, her eyes wide with surprise. Her heart skipped a beat. Strangers almost never spoke to her in her language. Most people would just smile politely or look a little confused when she signed. But here was someone she had never met, sitting in a cafe, speaking her language like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her hands moved quickly as she signed back. "You know sign language?" The man smiled warmly, nodding. "Yes," he signed. "My son is deaf." Sophie's face lit up like the morning sun. She leaned forward in excitement, her fingers moving fast as she asked questions about his son, about how he learned sign language, about everything she could think of. The man kept up with her energy easily, answering her with a gentle patience that only someone familiar with this world of silent words could have. Clara returned to the table carrying their drinks, and for a moment, she just stood there, watching. Her daughter was laughing, not out loud, but in the way her eyes sparkled and her hands danced. Clara had never seen her connect with a stranger so quickly. She set down the tray and sat quietly, not wanting to interrupt whatever magic was happening between them. The man looked up at Clara and gave a friendly nod. Speaking aloud now, but still signing so Sophie could follow, he said, "I hope you don't mind. Your daughter and I were just talking." Clara smiled, a little stunned. "Not at all. I'm just surprised. Most people, they don't know sign language. I learned when my son lost his hearing," he said. His voice was calm, steady. "It was the only way I could make sure he'd never feel left out." Sophie beamed at him, and Clara felt her chest tighten in the best possible way. Moments like this were rare, moments where her daughter could just be herself without barriers. For years, Clara had worried that Sophie would feel isolated from the world. But here was proof that there were people out there who could bridge the gap, people who cared enough to learn. They continued talking, the man shifting easily between voice and hands, making sure Sophie was part of every word. Sophie told him about her school, her love for drawing, and the new kitten they had adopted a few months ago. He told her about his son, how they liked building things together, and how his favorite place in the world was the beach at sunrise. The cafe seemed to fade away around them. The clinking of cups, the hiss of the coffee machine, the chatter of other customers. All of it became background noise to the small circle of connection forming at that little table. When the food arrived, Sophie was still grinning. She sipped her hot chocolate slowly, still stealing glances at the man as if to make sure he was real, and not some dream she'd imagined. Clara watched her daughter's happiness and felt something shift in her heart. She had walked into the cafe, expecting a quiet breakfast. She hadn't expected her daughter to meet someone who understood her world so naturally. It was a small thing, a shared language, a simple kindness, but for Sophie, it was everything. Sophie didn't want the conversation to end. Every time she finished signing one thing, another thought popped into her mind. Her hands moved quickly, her eyes bright with excitement. It was a rare sight. Clara couldn't remember the last time her daughter had been this animated with someone she had just met. The man, Daniel, didn't seem rushed at all. He leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table, giving Sophie his full attention. Every so often, he would smile in a way that made the corners of his eyes crinkle, the kind of smile that made you feel like what you were saying truly mattered. "You're really good at signing," Sophie told him through quick, graceful movements of her fingers. "Better than most people I know." Daniel chuckled softly. "I've had a good teacher," he replied, signing and speaking at the same time so Clara could follow. "My son. When he lost his hearing, I promised him I would learn to talk to him in his language. At first, it was hard. I kept mixing up signs, and he would laugh at me. But little by little, I got better." Sophie's head tilted slightly, her curiosity sparking again. "How old is your son?" she asked. "He's 10, Daniel said. A little older than you. Right now, he's at soccer practice. Otherwise, I'd have brought him here. I think you two would get along." Sophie smiled shyly at that, her hands slowing a bit. "I've never met another kid like me," she signed. "Not in real life." Daniel's expression softened. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he paused, his gaze dropping briefly to his coffee before he looked back at her. "Then we'll have to change that," he signed gently. "Because there are more kids like you, and like my son, than you think. And you deserve to know them." Clara felt a lump in her throat. She sipped her cappuccino slowly, letting their conversation wash over her. She could see the way Sophie's shoulders had relaxed, how her usual guardedness had melted away. Sophie wasn't just talking. She was being heard. The waitress came by to refill Daniel's coffee, and the moment was briefly interrupted by the clinking of cups. But as soon as she walked away, Sophie leaned in again. "Do you like drawing?" she asked him. Daniel smiled. "I'm not very good at it," he admitted. "But my son loves to draw. He fills notebooks with superheroes and animals and strange little creatures I've never seen before." Sophie grinned, quickly telling him about her own sketchbook at home, filled with cats, flowers, and scenes from her imagination. Daniel listened like every detail mattered, nodding, asking questions with his hands, and occasionally laughing. Outside the cafe window, the morning had grown brighter. People walked by carrying grocery bags, holding hands, or walking dogs. But inside, it felt like the three of them were in their own little bubble, time slowing down just enough to let them enjoy it. Clara noticed Daniel's leather notebook still sitting open beside him. She couldn't help but ask, "Are you a writer?" Daniel glanced at it and shrugged with a modest smile. "Not exactly. I jot down ideas, thoughts, little things I want to remember. Sometimes about my son, sometimes just about life." There was something about the way he said it, simple, unpretentious, that made Clara curious. She didn't press further, though. Instead, she looked at Sophie, who was still signing eagerly, clearly in her element. It struck Clara then how rare this was. Most of the time, in public spaces, Sophie had to work extra hard to connect with people. Strangers often avoided eye contact, unsure of how to communicate with her. But Daniel hadn't hesitated. He'd seen her, not her silence. Sophie's hot chocolate was almost gone, leaving a ring of foam at the bottom of the cup. She licked a bit of chocolate from her lip and signed, "Can I meet your son someday?" Daniel smiled warmly. "I'd like that. I think you would too." Clara didn't say anything right away. She was weighing her natural caution, the instinct to protect Sophie from disappointment, against the warmth she felt from this interaction. Something about Daniel's sincerity made her believe he meant every word. The conversation drifted to other things: favorite foods, the best places to watch the sunset, funny little habits their pets had. Sophie laughed more in those 20 minutes than she had in the entire week. Clara found herself laughing too. At one point, Daniel excused himself to grab another slice of pie. As he walked to the counter, Sophie turned to her mother, her hands moving quickly. "He's nice," she signed. "Really nice. Can we stay longer?" Clara smiled. "We can stay a little while," she signed back. Sophie's shoulders relaxed again, and she leaned back in her chair, her eyes following Daniel as he returned with his plate. It was such a small thing, a chance meeting in a cafe, but Clara had a feeling it might be the start of something that mattered. Daniel set his plate on the table and smiled at Sophie before taking a seat again. The new slice of pie was warm, and the smell of cinnamon drifted across the table. Sophie's eyes lingered on it for a moment, and Daniel noticed. "Want to try a bite?" he asked, speaking and signing at the same time. Sophie looked to her mother for permission. Clara gave a small nod, and Sophie grinned, leaning forward as Daniel cut a small piece with his fork and placed it on a napkin in front of her. She took the bite, and her eyes widened. Her hands moved quickly. "It's so good," she signed, her face lighting up. "Better than chocolate." Daniel laughed softly. "That's a big compliment coming from you." The three of them sat like that for a while, eating and talking. Daniel seemed to have a way of making Sophie feel comfortable without trying too hard. He didn't speak for her or treat her like she couldn't understand. Every sentence was signed and spoken, so she was included in every moment. After a few minutes, Clara finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind. "How did your son lose his hearing?" Her voice was gentle, not wanting to pry, but curious about the man who had just made her daughter so happy. Daniel paused, setting his fork down. He looked out the window for a moment before answering. "He got very sick when he was 6. An infection damaged his hearing completely. One day he could hear me reading him bedtime stories, and the next, the world was quiet for him. At first, I didn't know what to do. I felt helpless. But I realized that the one thing I could control was how I showed up for him. So I learned. Every night after work, I practiced. We made mistakes together, but we kept going." Sophie was watching his hands carefully, her expression serious now. She signed slowly. "Was he scared?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. But I stayed with him through all of it. I told him that even though sound was gone, our words could still reach each other another way." Clara felt a heaviness in her chest, a deep respect for the way Daniel spoke about his son. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't rehearsed. It was the voice of someone who had lived through something and chosen to love harder because of it. Sophie looked thoughtful for a moment, then her hands moved again. "I like how you talk with your hands. It makes me feel normal." Daniel's smile was soft but full of meaning. "You are normal. You're just you. And that's enough." The way he said it, like it was the simplest truth in the world, made Clara's throat tighten. She glanced at her daughter, who was sitting taller now, her expression proud in a quiet way. Their conversation drifted into lighter things again. Sophie asked about Daniel's favorite color, and he asked hers in return. They talked about books, about the smell of rain, about what they'd each do if they could spend a whole day anywhere they wanted. Sophie said she'd choose the zoo so she could draw the animals. Daniel said he'd choose the beach at sunrise, because that was when the world felt calm and full of hope. At one point, Sophie reached for her hot chocolate cup, only to find it empty. She made a small pout and looked at her mother. Clara laughed softly and went to the counter to order her another one. While she was gone, Sophie and Daniel kept signing. He told her about a story his son had written for school, about a boy who could fly, but only when no one was looking. Sophie's eyes lit up at the idea, and she started imagining her own version of the story, her fingers moving quickly as she told it. When Clara returned, she noticed something. Sophie's smile wasn't just happy, it was relaxed, natural, the kind that showed she felt completely safe in the moment. As the second hot chocolate arrived, Daniel glanced at his watch. "I'll need to go soon," he said, signing the words as he spoke. "I promised my son I'd pick him up from practice." Sophie's hand slowed for a moment, her expression dimming just a little. "Will we see you again?" she signed. Daniel hesitated for only a second before smiling. "I hope so. Maybe next weekend if you come here again." Sophie nodded quickly, her grin returning. Clara said nothing, but inside she felt a strange warmth. Something about this meeting didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like a small piece of fate. The cafe was quieter now. The morning rush had passed, leaving only a few customers scattered at the tables. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, casting golden patches on the floor. Clara took a slow sip of her coffee, watching Sophie and Daniel. She wasn't in a hurry for this moment to end. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands resting loosely on the table. He looked comfortable, as if he could have stayed there all day. "You know," he said, signing at the same time so Sophie could follow, "this place reminds me of a cafe I used to take my son to when he was younger. It became our little Saturday tradition." Sophie tilted her head with interest. "Do you still go?" she asked in signs. Daniel smiled, but there was a touch of something bittersweet in his eyes. "Not as much anymore. He's older now, and weekends are for sports or spending time with friends. But sometimes I think about those mornings, just the two of us, sitting together, talking about everything and nothing." Sophie's fingers moved. "Maybe you could come here more. With your son. And we could talk too." Clara couldn't help but smile at her daughter's suggestion. Sophie had always been shy around new people, but now she was openly inviting this man, and his son, into her little world. It spoke volumes about how safe she felt. "That's a good idea," Daniel said warmly. "I think my son would like you." There was a pause then, the kind where no one feels pressure to speak. Clara found herself studying Daniel. He didn't just talk to Sophie. He listened in a way that made her feel important. That wasn't something Sophie experienced often outside a family. Most adults either spoke over her or avoided conversation altogether, unsure how to bridge the communication gap. But Daniel had stepped right over that invisible wall without hesitation. Sophie took another bite of her croissant, and with a playful look, she signed, "You eat pie for breakfast?" Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Only on Saturdays," he replied with a grin. "It's my one bad habit." "Not bad." Sophie signed quickly. "Pie is good." The exchange made Clara chuckle quietly. There was a lightness at the table now, the kind that comes when strangers begin to feel like friends. It struck her how rare this kind of connection was, spontaneous, unplanned, yet so meaningful. As they talked, Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, and his expression softened. "That's my son," he said. "Practice just ended." He picked up the phone and quickly typed a reply before setting it back down. "You have to go?" Sophie asked. "Soon," Daniel signed. "But before I do," he reached for his notebook, tore out a page, and scribbled something down. He slid it across the table toward Clara. "My number. In case you and Sophie want to meet up sometime. Maybe for coffee, or the zoo, since she loves it so much." Clara hesitated for just a moment, then took the paper. "Thank you," she said softly. It wasn't just about the number. It was about opening a door to something new for Sophie. Daniel stood, slipping his notebook into his bag. He turned to Sophie and signed, "I'm glad I met you today." Sophie signed back quickly, "Me too." As Daniel walked toward the door, Sophie watched him go, her expression full of thought. When the bell above the cafe door jingled and he stepped out into the bright morning, she turned to her mother, her hands moving fast. "He's different," she signed. "In a good way." Clara nodded. "Yes, very different." They sat there for a while longer, finishing their drinks in comfortable silence. But Clara's mind kept drifting back to Daniel's words, to the way Sophie had lit up in his presence. She didn't know where this new connection might lead, but she had a feeling it wasn't the last time they'd see him. The walk home from the cafe was quiet, but it was the good kind of quiet. The air was cool and fresh, the kind that carried the faint smell of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the street. Sophie held her mother's hand, swinging it gently as they passed shop windows and small clusters of people enjoying the weekend. Clara glanced down at her daughter. Sophie wasn't smiling the way she had been in the cafe, but her eyes were thoughtful, almost dreamy, as if her mind was still replaying the morning. "You liked talking to him, didn't you?" Clara asked. Sophie nodded quickly and signed. "He listened to me. Not just waited for me to finish, but actually listened." That answer stayed with Clara. Too often, people were polite with Sophie, but there was a difference between politeness and true attention. Daniel had given her daughter his full focus, as if every word she signed was worth his time. When they reached home, Sophie went straight to her room and returned with her sketchbook. She sat at the kitchen table, flipping to a blank page. Clara watched from across the room as Sophie began to draw. At first, it was just simple outlines, a round table, 2 chairs, cups of coffee. Then Sophie added more detail, a steaming pie on a plate, a small notebook, and a man with kind eyes smiling across the table. "Is that Daniel?" Clara asked. Sophie looked up, her cheeks warming slightly, then nodded. She wrote his name in neat letters at the bottom of the page. "I want to show him this if we see him again," she signed. Clara smiled and placed a plate of apple slices in front of her. "I think he'd like that very much." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the gentle rhythm of a slow Saturday. Laundry, tidying up, and Sophie drawing quietly at the table. But every now and then, Clara caught her pausing, staring out the window, her pencil resting in her hand. Later in the evening, while Sophie was in her room, Clara took the slip of paper from her bag. Daniel's handwriting was neat and simple, the numbers written carefully. She turned it over in her fingers, debating. She wasn't sure if she should call him right away or wait. A part of her didn't want to seem too eager, but another part thought about Sophie's words. "He listened to me." That night after dinner, Sophie signed. "Do you think his son will like me?" Clara looked at her for a moment before answering. "I think anyone who takes the time to know you will like you." Sophie nodded slowly, but her expression told Clara she was already imagining what it would be like to meet another child who used sign language. The idea seemed to excite her and make her nervous all at once. Before bed, Sophie left her sketchbook on the coffee table. The cafe drawing was still open, and Clara lingered on it for a moment. She realized it wasn't just a picture. It was a memory Sophie didn't want to forget. And maybe it was the beginning of something that could change the way her daughter saw the world. When Clara finally turned off the lights and went to bed, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would send Daniel a message soon. She didn't know what would come of it, but she couldn't ignore the way Sophie's eyes had come alive that morning. And sometimes, life handed you moments that felt small, but turned out to mean everything. The following Saturday morning arrived with soft sunshine spilling through the kitchen window. Sophie was already dressed before Clara had even called her for breakfast. She wore her yellow scarf again, the same one she'd worn the day they met Daniel. Clara didn't need to ask why. She could see the excitement in her daughter's eyes. After they finished eating, Clara tucked Daniel's number into her pocket. She had messaged him earlier in the week, and he'd replied quickly, suggesting they meet at the cafe again. This time, he would bring his son. As they approached the familiar corner, Sophie squeezed her mother's hand, her steps quickening. Through the cafe window, she spotted Daniel sitting at the same table as before. Beside him was a boy about her age with dark hair and curious eyes. He was flipping through a small comic book, occasionally glancing toward the door. When they walked in, Daniel stood to greet them, his warm smile just as genuine as before. "Good morning," he said, signing the words at the same time. His son looked up and Daniel signed something to him. The boy's face lit up, and he quickly put his comic book away. "This is Liam," Daniel said, motioning to his son. Sophie gave a small wave, then began signing shyly. "Hello. I'm Sophie." Liam's hands moved in return, his signs quick and confident. "Hi, Sophie. My dad told me about you." They all sat down together, and within minutes, Sophie and Liam were deep in conversation, their hands moving in an easy rhythm. They talked about school, favorite snacks, and the best animals at the zoo. Clara and Daniel watched them, occasionally glancing at each other with quiet smiles. "I think I'm going to get along just fine," Daniel said softly. Clara nodded, her heart full. It's good for her to have someone who understands. They sipped their coffee while the children continued chatting, oblivious to the rest of the cafe. Every so often, Sophie would laugh, not out loud, but in the bright way her eyes crinkled and her shoulders shook. Liam would grin in return, signing something that made her laugh even harder. At one point, Sophie pulled her sketchbook from her bag and opened to the drawing she'd made. She slid it across the table to Daniel. His eyes softened as he looked at it, taking in every detail, the table, the pie, the notebook. "This is beautiful," he said, his voice low with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, Sophie." She signed back, "It's for you. So you remember that day." Daniel glanced at Clara, and she could tell he was moved. He carefully folded the drawing and slipped it into his notebook, the same one from that first meeting. "I'll keep it safe," he promised. The morning passed quickly. The children shared a slice of pie, just like last time, and made plans, in signs, for the next weekend. Clara realized she hadn't seen Sophie this animated in a long time. There was no shyness, no hesitation, just an easy flow of connection. When it was time to leave, they all walked out together. The sunlight felt warmer than it had when they arrived. Liam waved goodbye with both hands, and Sophie did the same. Daniel looked at Clara and smiled. "I'm glad you came today." "So am I," she replied. As they walked home, Sophie's steps were lighter, almost like she was floating. She signed, "I think I made my first real friend." Clara's chest tightened with emotion. She squeezed her daughter's hand and signed back, "I think you did too." And in that simple moment, Clara knew this wasn't just a passing encounter. It was the start of something real, for Sophie, for Liam, and maybe, in a quiet way, for all of them.